The woman everyone expected to see standing beside him was not his wife anymore, it was the woman who helped destroy her marriage, walking beside the woman he tried to erase. The first camera flash came before anyone understood what was happening. Inside one of Manhattan's most exclusive fashion venues, hundreds of guests gathered beneath glowing crystal lights, waiting for the moment everyone had been anticipating. Tonight was supposed to belong to Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire CEO. The face of Caldwell Empire. The man whose name had become synonymous with luxury fashion. He sat in the front row wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, surrounded by investors, designers, and industry leaders who admired everything he had built. At least, that was what they believed. Ethan smiled as photographers captured his image. He looked completely in control. Because for years, he had mastered one thing better than anything else. Creating the perfect story. A story where he was the visionary. The creator. The man who turned a small fashion company into an international empire. But tonight, another name was waiting to be remembered. Charlotte Bennett. The woman Ethan believed had disappeared from the world he controlled. The woman he thought would never stand beneath these lights again. The runway music faded. The conversation slowed. Then the massive doors at the entrance opened. Everyone turned. Charlotte Bennett walked into the room. She was wearing a simple ivory gown with elegant lines and a design only a true creator could understand. No excessive jewelry. No attempt to compete for attention. No need to prove anything. She moved with a quiet confidence that made the entire room notice her. Because Charlotte was not walking like someone returning after being forgotten. She was walking like someone who had finally found her place. But she was not alone. A second woman stepped beside her. And the room froze. Madison Reed. The famous model. The woman whose face had appeared beside Ethan Caldwell on countless magazine covers. The woman the world believed had replaced Charlotte. The woman everyone blamed for the end of their marriage. Whispers spread through the room. Some guests looked confused. Others looked shocked. Because nobody understood why Ethan's former mistress was walking beside his ex-wife. Ethan slowly stood from his seat. For the first time that evening, his perfect expression disappeared. Madison? His voice was quiet. But everyone nearby heard the surprise. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to stand beside him. She was supposed to represent the future of Caldwell Empire. Instead, she was standing beside the woman he had spent years trying to remove from the picture. Charlotte looked toward Ethan. For a moment, the entire history between them existed in the silence. The marriage. The betrayal. The years of sacrifice. The moment she realized the man she loved had built his success by making her invisible. But Charlotte did not look angry. She did not look defeated. She looked free. Ethan stepped closer. What is this? Charlotte glanced toward the runway. The lights reflected softly against her face. This is my show. A pause. And for once, it has nothing to do with you. The words were simple. But they carried years of everything she never said. 3 years earlier, Charlotte Bennett was known as the quiet woman behind Caldwell Empire. Not the founder. Not the genius. Not the name printed on the invitations. Behind. That was where Ethan wanted her. She created the designs. She selected fabrics. She spent endless nights perfecting collections that later carried his signature. When investors praised Caldwell Empire's unique style, they praised Ethan. When magazines wrote about his creative instincts, they wrote about Ethan. Charlotte's work became his success story. And she convinced herself that love meant sharing the spotlight. Until she realized she was the only one sharing. Ethan slowly removed her from the company he built with her talent. First, he stopped introducing her as his creative partner. Then he called her his inspiration. As if being admired from a distance was the same as being respected. Then Madison entered his life. Young. beautiful, famous. Everything Ethan believed would make his empire look stronger. Charlotte remembered the first time she saw Madison wearing a dress she had personally designed. A dress created during a sleepless night. A dress that once existed only in Charlotte's sketchbook. Now it carried Ethan's name. That was the moment she understood. He had not simply replaced her. He had taken everything she created and convinced the world it was never hers. The divorce was quiet. Everyone expected Charlotte to fight. To expose him. To destroy the man who betrayed her. But she did none of those things. She signed the papers. She walked away. And she carried only one thing with her. An old sketchbook filled with the designs she created before Ethan ever knew her worth. He watched her leave and believed he had won. "You'll regret this," he told her. Charlotte stopped at the door. Not because she was hurt. Because she finally understood something. A person who steals your name can never steal your ability to create another one. Now, years later, Ethan Caldwell was watching that truth walk into his own event. The runway lights brightened. The audience became silent. And beside Charlotte stood the one person Ethan never expected. The woman who knew his secrets. The woman who knew his lies. The woman who had finally realized she was never the winner. She was simply another person he used. The first model stepped onto the runway. And as the world watched Charlotte Bennett's collection begin, Ethan felt something he had not felt in years. Uncertainty. Because for the first time, he was not controlling the story. He was watching it unfold. She thought becoming the woman beside him meant she had won, until she discovered she was only standing where another woman had already been erased. Before Madison Reed ever stood beside Charlotte Bennett at the runway show, before the cameras captured the impossible image of an ex-wife walking in with her husband's former mistress, there was a moment when everything began to fall apart. A moment hidden behind expensive clothes, luxury events, and carefully written headlines. A moment when Charlotte realized the greatest loss was not losing Ethan Caldwell. It was losing the recognition she deserved. Years earlier, before Caldwell Empire became a global fashion name, Charlotte Bennett was not a forgotten designer. She was the beginning. In a small apartment in Manhattan, surrounded by rolls of fabric and unfinished sketches, Charlotte created the first collection that would eventually change Ethan's life. The room was never glamorous. The lights were too dim. The table was too small. The sewing machine was old and constantly making strange noises. But Charlotte loved that room. Because everything inside it belonged to her. Every idea. Every design. Every dream. She remembered the nights when Ethan would sit beside her, watching her work. "You have something special," he once told her. And she believed him. At that time, Ethan was not the powerful CEO everyone admired. He was simply a man with ambition. A man who believed in her. Together, they built something from nothing. Charlotte created the vision. Ethan created the connections. She designed the collections. He presented them to investors. They were supposed to become partners. But success has a way of revealing what people truly value. As Caldwell Empire grew, Ethan slowly changed. At first, Charlotte barely noticed. Small things. Simple things. During interviews, he started saying, "I always knew what the market wanted." Instead of, "We built this together." At company meetings, her ideas were presented without mentioning her name. At fashion events, people praised Ethan's creativity while Charlotte stood quietly in the background. She told herself it did not matter. She was not creating for attention. She was creating because fashion was part of who she was. But slowly, she began disappearing from the story. The world saw Ethan Caldwell as the genius behind the brand. The visionary. The billionaire who transformed the industry. Almost nobody knew about the woman who spent thousands of hours creating the designs that made him famous. And Ethan preferred it that way. Then Madison Reed entered his life. She was everything the media loved. Young. beautiful, confident. A successful model whose face could sell anything. When Ethan introduced her at public events, the cameras followed. The world saw a powerful businessman with a beautiful new partner. But Charlotte saw something else. She saw one of her own designs. The first time she saw Madison wearing a Caldwell Empire gown inspired by Charlotte's original sketches, she felt something inside her break. Not because Madison wore it. Because nobody knew who created it. The dress that represented years of Charlotte's creativity carried Ethan's name. Not hers. That night, Charlotte returned home and opened her old sketchbook. Page after page showed the truth. Original designs. Original ideas. Original dreams. Her handwriting covered every corner. But none of those pages had ever reached the public. Ethan had taken the finished product and left behind the person who created it. The confrontation came quietly. No shouting. No dramatic scene. Just two people standing in a beautiful apartment that no longer felt like home. You knew this would happen, Charlotte said. Ethan looked confused. Knew what? That one day everyone would believe you built everything alone. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he gave the answer she would never forget. Charlotte, ideas are valuable. But someone has to know how to turn them into success. She stared at him. Because in that moment, she understood. Ethan did not hate her talent. He simply believed her talent belonged to him. The divorce was finalized weeks later. People expected Charlotte to fight. They expected a public battle. A scandal. A revenge story. But Charlotte did something nobody expected. She walked away quietly. She left behind the penthouse. The luxury. The company. The life everyone thought she wanted. She took only one thing. Her old sketchbook. The same sketchbook Ethan believed had no value without his name attached to it. When she closed the door behind her, Charlotte felt the weight of everything she had lost. But she also felt something she had not felt in years. Freedom. Because sometimes the moment someone takes away everything you depended on is the moment you finally discover what was truly yours. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell continued building his empire. And Madison Reed stepped into the space Charlotte left behind. She believed she had become the woman who won. She believed she had taken the place of someone who failed. But she did not know the truth yet. She did not know that Charlotte Bennett was not gone. She was rebuilding. And one day, the woman Madison thought she replaced would return with something far more powerful than revenge. Her own name. The moment she saw another woman wearing her creation, Charlotte Bennett did not lose her husband, she lost the illusion that he ever saw her as his equal. For a long time, Charlotte believed betrayal would arrive with a loud sound. A confession. An argument. A door closing. But the truth was quieter. It arrived beneath the glow of luxury lights. It arrived in the form of a dress. A dress she had created with her own hands. 3 years before the Runway show where she would return with Madison Reed beside her, Charlotte stood inside a crowded fashion gala watching the world celebrate someone else's success. The room was filled with everything she once dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers. Expensive gowns. Fashion executives carrying glasses of champagne. Cameras flashing toward the people everyone believed mattered. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell. Confident. Charismatic. Untouchable. The media surrounded him as he spoke about the future of Caldwell Empire. Our vision has always been about creating timeless fashion, he said. The crowd listened. The cameras recorded. And Charlotte stood several feet away, hearing a sentence that no longer felt like pride. It felt like theft. Because she knew exactly where that vision came from. It came from the nights she spent alone in her studio. It came from the sketches covering her apartment floor. It came from the countless hours she spent adjusting fabrics until every detail felt perfect. But when Ethan spoke about the company's success, her name was never mentioned. Not once. Then the doors opened. Madison Reed entered. The room changed instantly. People turned. Photographers lifted their cameras. Ethan's expression softened. A smile appeared on his face. A smile Charlotte remembered. A smile that once belonged to her. Madison walked confidently through the crowd wearing a breathtaking black gown. And Charlotte recognized it immediately. The curved neckline. The hand-stitched details. The delicate pattern along the fabric. It was one of her designs. A design she created 2 years earlier in a small apartment while Ethan slept beside her. A design she had sketched after midnight, when the city outside her window was silent. Now it belonged to someone else. Charlotte stared at the dress. Not because Madison was wearing it. But because Madison did not know who created it. That was the part that hurt the most. Madison smiled for the cameras while reporters praised Ethan's creative direction. They called him a genius. They called him a visionary. Nobody asked who drew the first line. Nobody asked who spent the sleepless nights turning ideas into reality. Nobody asked Charlotte. Later that evening, Charlotte returned to the apartment she shared with Ethan. The place was beautiful. A view of Manhattan. Designer furniture. Everything money could buy. But for the first time, it felt empty. She placed her bag on the table and looked at the framed photos around the room. Their wedding. Their first company meeting. Their first collection. A life that once looked like a dream. Then Ethan walked in. He noticed her silence. "You're upset." Charlotte looked at him. "I saw Madison tonight." Ethan removed his jacket. "And?" "She was wearing my design." A pause. Only a brief one. But Charlotte noticed. "You knew." Ethan looked away. "Charlotte, no." Her voice remained calm. That was what surprised him. She was not screaming. She was not crying. She was simply seeing him clearly for the first time. "You knew people thought those designs were yours." Ethan sighed. "You're making this more complicated than it is." Charlotte stared at him. "How?" He stepped closer. "Because business is not about who creates the idea. It is about who knows how to make it successful." The words stayed in the room. Cold. Carefully chosen. And painful because they revealed the truth. Ethan did not believe he stole from her. He believed he deserved what he took. Charlotte looked down at her hands. The same hands that had created the collections. The same hands that built the foundation beneath his empire. And suddenly, she understood. She was not his partner. She was his hidden advantage. The person behind the success. The person he could erase when the world no longer needed to know. The divorce happened quietly. There were no headlines. No public accusations. No dramatic battle. Charlotte simply packed her belongings and left. Ethan watched her walk away. He expected anger. He expected revenge. He expected her to fight for recognition. But she did something far more powerful. She stayed silent. Because Charlotte had finally learned something. A person can take your position. They can take your credit. They can even take your name from a company you helped create. But they cannot take the ability that created everything in the first place. After leaving Ethan, Charlotte moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn. The first night there, she opened her old sketchbook. The pages were filled with years of ideas. Years of dreams. Years of the woman she used to be. At the bottom of every drawing was the same signature. Charlotte Bennett. For the first time in years, she looked at her own name and understood its value. Not because Ethan recognized it. Because she did. Meanwhile, Ethan continued building his empire. And Madison stepped into the life Charlotte left behind. The world believed she had won. But she did not know what Charlotte already discovered. Ethan Caldwell did not replace one woman with another. He repeated the same pattern. And one day, both women would finally see the same truth. The person they needed to escape was never each other. It was him. The first thing Charlotte Bennett bought after losing everything was not a luxury dress, a new apartment, or a symbol of success. It was an old sewing machine that barely worked. The machine sat in the corner of a small Brooklyn studio, covered with dust and years of forgotten memories. To anyone else, it looked worthless. The paint was fading. The metal frame was scratched. The motor made a strange sound every time it started. But to Charlotte, it was more than a machine. It was proof. Proof that before there was Caldwell Empire, before there were magazine covers, before Ethan Caldwell's name became famous, there was a woman creating something with her own hands. A woman who was finally ready to take back what belonged to her. The first months after the divorce were not glamorous. There were no cameras waiting outside. No investors calling her phone. No assistants organizing her schedule. No one introducing her as the creative force behind a billion-dollar fashion empire. For the first time in years, Charlotte Bennett was completely unknown. And strangely, that felt peaceful. Her new apartment was small. The kitchen barely had enough space for one person. The walls were plain. The windows faced an old brick building instead of the Manhattan skyline she once woke up to. But every morning, sunlight entered through those windows. And every morning, Charlotte woke up knowing one thing. Nobody could take this life away from her. Because she had built it herself. At first, rebuilding seemed impossible. The fashion industry was not interested in the woman who disappeared from Caldwell Empire. They were interested in the story Ethan created. When people heard the name Charlotte Bennett, they did not think of a designer. They thought, Ethan Caldwell's ex-wife. The woman who lost everything. The woman who walked away. But Charlotte refused to let someone else define the ending of her story. She started small. Very small. She designed custom pieces for local clients. She repaired old dresses. She created new collections late into the night while the city slept outside her window. There were nights when she questioned herself. Nights when she stared at unfinished sketches and wondered if Ethan was right. Maybe talent was not enough. Maybe recognition belonged only to those who knew how to sell themselves. Then she would open her old sketchbook. The same one she carried out of her marriage. The same one filled with ideas nobody knew existed. And she would remember. Every famous design Ethan presented to the world started with these pages. Every successful collection began with her imagination. Slowly, one client became 5. 5 became 20. People began sharing photos of her designs online. Not because of her history. Not because she was Ethan Caldwell's former wife. Because the work spoke for itself. Charlotte noticed something unexpected. Without Ethan beside her, people finally saw her. Not as someone's partner. Not as someone behind a powerful man. But as a creator. One morning, while Charlotte was adjusting a handmade jacket in her studio, an elderly woman entered carrying a worn folder. Her name was Helen Whitmore. She owned a small tailoring workshop that had survived in Brooklyn for more than 30 years. "I heard you were creating again," Helen said. Charlotte looked surprised. "Creating again?" Helen smiled softly. "People like you never stop creating. They only stop showing the world." Inside the folder were photographs. Old photographs. From the beginning of Caldwell Empire. Charlotte recognized them immediately. Her first collection. Her original designs. Her handwritten notes. But something else caught her attention. A small signature appeared in the corner of each photograph. Her signature. Charlotte stared at the images. For years, she thought those memories belonged to the past. Now she realized they were evidence. Evidence that her talent existed before Ethan's empire. Evidence that her name had a history. That evening, Charlotte returned to her studio and placed the photographs beside her sketches. For the first time, she was not rebuilding what she lost. She was building something new. Something that had never belonged to Ethan. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell continued appearing in headlines. Caldwell Empire announced another successful season. Madison Reed remained the face of the brand. The world believed everything was exactly as it should be. But behind the polished images, cracks were beginning to appear. Because Madison was starting to notice things. The designs Ethan called his own. The decisions he made without explanation. The way employees avoided certain conversations when she entered the room. She began asking questions. Questions Ethan did not want answered. And while Ethan focused on protecting the empire he built from Charlotte's talent, Charlotte quietly created something far more dangerous. A name. Her own. Months later, an invitation arrived at her studio. A major fashion showcase in Manhattan. A place where the industry's most powerful people would gather. At the bottom of the invitation was a simple message: your work deserves to be seen. Charlotte held the card in her hand. Years ago, she entered those rooms beside Ethan. Now she would return alone. Not as his wife. Not as a forgotten designer. But as Charlotte Bennett. The woman who had finally stopped asking for permission to shine. The woman Ethan Caldwell replaced was never the biggest threat to his empire, the woman he replaced her with was. For months, Madison Reed believed she had stepped into a life that belonged to someone else. And in a way, she had. She had the luxury apartment. The designer clothes. The invitations to exclusive events. The cameras waiting whenever she appeared beside Ethan Caldwell. From the outside, it looked like a victory. A beautiful woman had replaced the forgotten wife. A new chapter had begun. That was the story everyone believed. Including Madison. But behind the carefully edited photographs and glamorous headlines, something felt wrong. Something she could not explain. Because the more time she spent inside Ethan's world, the more she noticed the pieces that did not fit. At first, they were small things. A conversation that suddenly stopped when she entered the room. An assistant who looked uncomfortable when Ethan claimed credit for a new collection. Old employees who still spoke about the original designs but never mentioned who created them. Madison noticed everything. She was a model. Her entire career had been built on reading people. Reading expressions. Reading silence. Reading what existed behind the image. And the image of Ethan Caldwell was beginning to crack. One evening, Madison stood inside the Caldwell Empire headquarters, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of fashion pieces. The building was everything Ethan wanted the world to see. Modern. Powerful. Perfect. She walked through the design department after a late photo shoot. Most employees had already left. The silence felt unusual. Then she noticed a door slightly open. Inside was an old archive room. A place nobody talked about. Madison stepped inside. Rows of forgotten files filled the shelves. Old collections. Past campaigns. Original sketches. She was not searching for anything specific. Not until she saw a familiar name. Charlotte Bennett. Her fingers stopped. Slowly, she pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs of early Caldwell Empire collections. Not the polished versions she had seen in magazines. The originals. The first ideas. The first sketches. And there it was. Charlotte's signature. Madison stared at the pages. The same elegant lines. The same creative style. The same designs Ethan had always called his vision. For a moment, she felt something she did not expect. Guilt. Because suddenly, she remembered every time she had stood beside Ethan while the world praised him. Every interview where she smiled while reporters celebrated his genius. Every time Charlotte's name was mentioned as nothing more than his ex-wife. Madison closed the folder. But the truth had already entered her mind. Charlotte was not the woman who failed. Charlotte was the woman who built everything. The next morning, Madison confronted Ethan. She waited until they were alone in his office. The city skyline stretched behind him. The same view Charlotte once had. The same view Madison now occupied. Who created the first Caldwell collections? Ethan looked up from his desk. The question surprised him. What kind of question is that? A simple one. He smiled slightly. The same confident smile that had convinced investors, reporters, and the entire world. We created them. Madison looked at him. Not impressed. Not convinced. You mean you and Charlotte? The silence lasted only a second. But it answered everything. Ethan leaned back. Madison, don't let emotions confuse you. That sentence made her understand. Because it was never about Charlotte. It was never about Madison. It was about Ethan always needing someone behind him. Someone whose talent could make him look extraordinary. Someone whose work could become his success. Madison lowered her voice. She created the empire you are standing in. Ethan's expression hardened. Be careful. There it was. Not anger. Not sadness. Control. The same control Charlotte had lived with for years. Madison walked away without another word. For the first time, she saw the truth clearly. She was not the woman who replaced Charlotte. She was simply the next person Ethan believed he could use. Meanwhile, Charlotte continued preparing for her return. The invitation to the Manhattan Fashion Showcase sat on her studio table. The event would bring together the most influential names in the industry. Designers. Investors. Critics. And Ethan Caldwell. Charlotte knew exactly what that meant. Walking into that room would bring back everything she had left behind. The whispers. The judgment. The memories. But this time, she would not enter as Ethan Caldwell's wife. She would not stand behind someone else's name. She would not wait for someone to recognize her. She had spent years rebuilding quietly. Now it was time for the world to see what had been hidden. The night before the showcase, Charlotte stood alone in her studio. Her newest collection surrounded her. Every piece carried a story. Every detail carried a part of her journey. She touched the fabric of the final dress. Not because it represented revenge. Because it represented freedom. Then her phone rang. The name on the screen surprised her. Madison Reed. Charlotte answered. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Two women connected by the same man. Two women who had once been placed against each other. Finally, Madison whispered, I know the truth. Charlotte closed her eyes. Because she already knew what truth Madison meant. The truth about Ethan. The truth about the designs. The truth about who had really been erased. And for the first time, the two women who were supposed to hate each other realized something. They had never been enemies. They had both been victims of the same story. And tomorrow night, at Charlotte Bennett's Runway show, that story was about to change. The night before her greatest comeback, Charlotte Bennett stood in front of hundreds of designs, but the most important thing she created was not a dress. It was the woman she had become. The Manhattan skyline glowed beneath a dark velvet sky. Inside a quiet studio hidden above an old brick building, Charlotte Bennett stood alone. No assistants. No cameras. No investors waiting for approval. Only silence. And the sound of fabric moving beneath her fingertips. Tomorrow night would be the biggest moment of her career. The same fashion world that once ignored her would finally see her name. Not attached to Ethan Caldwell. Not hidden behind a powerful man. Just Charlotte Bennett. The designer. The creator. The woman who had spent years rebuilding everything from nothing. She looked around the studio. Every corner carried a memory. The small table where she drew her first collection. The worn chair where she spent countless nights working until sunrise. The shelves filled with fabrics she purchased one piece at a time because she could not afford more. This place was not luxurious. It was not impressive. But it was hers. And that meant more than any penthouse she had ever lived in. Charlotte picked up the final piece of her collection. A long ivory gown. Simple. Elegant. Powerful. Unlike the dresses Ethan used to showcase, this one did not scream for attention. It did not need to. The beauty was in the details. The careful stitching. The hidden patterns. The story woven into every layer. A story about losing herself. And finding herself again. A few hours earlier, Charlotte had received the phone call from Madison Reed. She still remembered the silence between them. Two women who had once been placed on opposite sides of a story. One was called the betrayed wife. The other was called the replacement. The world had created a rivalry between them before either woman understood the truth. But when Madison admitted what she discovered about Ethan, something inside Charlotte changed. Not because she forgave everything. Not because the past disappeared. But because she realized something important. Madison was not the reason her marriage ended. Madison was simply another person who had fallen into Ethan's carefully controlled world. After the call ended, Charlotte sat quietly for a long time. She thought about the years she spent blaming herself. The moments she questioned whether she was talented enough. The nights she wondered if walking away meant she had lost. Now she knew better. Leaving was not losing. Sometimes walking away was the first step toward becoming someone new. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the venue before anyone else. The runway was still empty. The lights were still off. Rows of chairs waited for guests who had no idea what they were about to witness. She walked slowly through the space. Years ago, she entered rooms like this beside Ethan. Always one step behind. Always introduced as his wife. Never as the woman whose hands created the vision. Tomorrow would be different. Her name would appear on every invitation. Her designs would carry her signature. Her story would belong to her. As the team prepared the venue, Charlotte watched from a distance. She noticed something she never expected. People were excited. Not because of Ethan Caldwell. Not because of Caldwell Empire. Because of her. The realization was overwhelming. For years, she chased recognition from people who benefited from ignoring her. Now, without asking for permission, she had built something they could not ignore. That afternoon, Madison arrived at the venue. For a moment, the two women simply looked at each other. No anger. No competition. No bitterness. Only understanding. "I should have known sooner," Madison said quietly. Charlotte looked at her. Knowing sooner wouldn't have changed what happened. Madison lowered her eyes. "But it could have changed how long it took you to come back." Charlotte gave a small smile. And for the first time, there was no pain between them. Only respect. That evening, the final preparations were complete. The invitations had been delivered. The guests were confirmed. The fashion industry's most powerful names would be there. Including Ethan Caldwell. Charlotte knew he would come. A man like Ethan always came when he believed the spotlight belonged to him. He would expect to see the woman he left behind. The woman who lost. The woman who disappeared. But he would not find her. Instead, he would find someone he never expected. Someone who no longer needed his approval. Someone who no longer needed revenge. Charlotte stood in front of the mirror before leaving the studio. She wore no expensive jewelry. No symbols of wealth. Only confidence. She looked at her reflection. The woman staring back was different from the one who signed the divorce papers years ago. That woman was broken. This woman was complete. The next night, the doors of the runway show would open. The cameras would arrive. The world would watch. And Ethan Caldwell would finally discover the truth. He never destroyed Charlotte Bennett. He only gave her the reason to become unstoppable. Everyone came to see Ethan Caldwell's empire, But nobody expected to witness the moment the woman he erased became the only person they could not ignore. The sound of camera shutters filled the grand hall. Flash after flash reflected against the polished marble floor of Manhattan's most exclusive fashion venue. Tonight was supposed to be another victory for Ethan Caldwell. Another headline. Another reminder of his power. The invitations carried his name among the most influential people in the fashion industry. Executives. Celebrities. Investors. Everyone who mattered was there. And Ethan made sure they knew it. He stood near the entrance wearing a perfectly tailored suit, shaking hands and accepting compliments as if the entire evening belonged to him. Caldwell Empire continues to redefine luxury, one investor said. Ethan smiled. That has always been our vision. Our. The word sounded natural coming from his mouth. Because for years, he had become skilled at rewriting history. But tonight, history was about to rewrite itself. Across the room, guests gathered around the runway. The lights dimmed. The conversations became quieter. Everyone waited for the show to begin. Ethan took his seat in the front row beside several industry leaders. Madison Reed sat a few seats away. For the first time in years, she did not look like the woman who had won. She looked thoughtful. Careful. As if she was finally seeing the world she had entered. Then the doors opened. The room changed. A wave of whispers moved through the crowd. Charlotte Bennett walked inside. Not hurried. Not nervous. Not looking for approval. She entered like someone who belonged there. Because she did. The woman Ethan once introduced as his wife. The woman the world forgot. The woman who disappeared after the divorce. Was standing in the center of attention again. But this time, nobody was looking at Ethan first. They were looking at her. Charlotte wore a simple black gown from her own collection. No diamonds. No obvious signs of wealth. Only elegance. Only confidence. The kind of confidence that money could never purchase. Ethan froze. For a moment, his expression revealed something the cameras had never captured before. Shock. Because the woman standing in front of him was not the woman who left his penthouse years ago. That woman had been hurt. This woman was untouchable. He stood slowly. Charlotte. His voice carried surprise. She looked at him. A calm expression rested on her face. Hello, Ethan. 2 words. Nothing more. But somehow, they carried years of silence. Years of being overlooked. Years of watching someone else take credit for her work. Ethan glanced around the room. He noticed people watching. He noticed the attention had shifted. And that bothered him more than he expected. Because Ethan Caldwell had always controlled the room. Until tonight. A journalist approached Charlotte. Charlotte Bennett? The designer behind tonight's showcase? She smiled. Yes. The journalist looked surprised. I thought you were no longer involved in fashion. Charlotte looked toward the runway. I never left fashion. A pause. I only left a place where my name didn't belong. The words were quiet. But several people nearby heard them. Including Ethan. The music started. The first model stepped onto the runway. The audience became silent. And then the collection appeared. One design after another. Each piece carried Charlotte's signature style. Elegant. Emotional. Powerful. The crowd reacted immediately. Fashion critics leaned forward. Investors exchanged impressed looks. People who once ignored her were now studying every detail. Because they could see something Ethan could never explain. This was not a comeback. This was an arrival. Madison watched from her seat. She looked at Charlotte walking beside the runway. And for the first time, she understood the difference between fame and respect. She had spent years standing beside Ethan because she believed that was where power existed. But Charlotte stood alone. And somehow, she had more power than anyone in the room. Ethan leaned toward one of his executives. Who approved this event? The executive hesitated. Charlotte's team arranged everything. Ethan's jaw tightened. Her team. Her company. Her success. Words he never expected to hear. Because he still saw the woman who left as someone who lost everything. He did not understand that losing him was the beginning of finding herself. The final model stepped onto the runway. The lights focused on the last creation. The ivory gown. The same dress Charlotte had touched the night before. The room fell silent. It was not just beautiful. It was personal. A symbol of everything she survived. When the show ended, the audience stood. Applause filled the room. Charlotte stepped onto the runway. No tears. No anger. No need to explain. She simply looked at the crowd. And then, for a brief second, her eyes met Ethan's. He expected bitterness. He expected satisfaction. But he saw something else. Peace. And that was the one thing he could never take from her. Because Ethan finally understood. Charlotte Bennett did not return to destroy him. She returned to prove she never needed him. And the most painful part for him was watching everyone else realize it too. The most powerful moment of the night was not when Charlotte Bennett walked onto the runway, it was when Ethan Caldwell finally realized the woman he abandoned had become the person his empire could not survive without. The applause was still echoing through the hall. Hundreds of people stood. Not for Ethan Caldwell. Not for Caldwell Empire. For Charlotte Bennett. The woman who was once introduced as someone standing beside greatness had just proven she was the greatness everyone overlooked. Charlotte remained on the runway for a few seconds, surrounded by the glow of the lights. She did not smile with pride. She did not look toward Ethan searching for a reaction. She simply stood there. Calm. Composed. Complete. And that silence was louder than any speech she could have given. Behind the curtain, journalists rushed toward her. Charlotte, where have you been all these years? Is this a direct challenge to Caldwell Empire? Did Ethan Caldwell know about this collection? The questions came quickly. But Charlotte answered slowly. I wasn't hiding. She looked at the runway behind her. I was rebuilding. The sentence spread through the room. Simple. Honest. Impossible to ignore. Across the hall, Ethan watched. For years, he had controlled every narrative surrounding his life. Every interview. Every headline. Every public appearance. But tonight, he was watching someone else become the story. And he hated that he could not control it. His assistant approached quietly. Mr. Caldwell, Ethan did not look away. Find out who is backing her. The assistant hesitated. She built the collection herself. Ethan finally turned. No one returns to this level without support. The assistant looked uncomfortable. But Ethan was already searching for an explanation. Because accepting the truth was harder. Charlotte did not need anyone behind her. She had built herself. Meanwhile, Madison stood near the entrance watching everything unfold. She saw Ethan's reaction. The tension in his face. The frustration behind his carefully controlled expression. And for the first time, Madison understood something deeper. Ethan was not upset because Charlotte came back. He was upset because Charlotte came back without needing him. That was the one thing he could never accept. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Charlotte stood backstage organizing her final pieces. The room was quiet again. Just like her old studio. Just like the nights when nobody knew her name. Then footsteps approached. She turned. Madison stood there. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The world had spent years telling them they were enemies. The wife. The mistress. The woman who was replaced. The woman who replaced her. But standing there, surrounded by Charlotte's creations, they both knew the truth was more complicated. "I owe you an apology," Madison said softly. Charlotte looked at her. "For what?" "For believing I won something when I was actually standing inside someone else's loss." The words surprised Charlotte. Because they carried something Ethan never offered. Accountability. Charlotte placed a dress carefully into its case. "You didn't take my life, Madison." Madison looked up. "I was part of it." "No," Charlotte replied. Her voice remained gentle. "You were part of his story." A silence followed. And Madison understood. The person who caused the damage was never the woman standing across from her. It was the man who convinced them both that only one of them could be valued. Then the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Ethan walked backstage. His expression was controlled. But his eyes revealed uncertainty. "Charlotte." She turned. "Yes?" For once, he seemed to struggle finding the right words. "You made a beautiful collection." A compliment. But somehow, it sounded like an admission. Charlotte simply nodded. "Thank you." Ethan looked around at the designs. The same creativity he once dismissed. The same talent he believed needed his name. "I didn't know you could build something like this." Charlotte looked at him. And that sentence told her everything. Not because it was insulting. Because it revealed how little he had understood her. "You never asked," she said. The room became quiet. Ethan had no answer. Because it was true. He spent years benefiting from Charlotte's talent without ever truly seeing her. He saw what she created. But not who she was. Then the doors opened. A group of investors entered. People Ethan recognized immediately. Powerful names in fashion. One of them approached Charlotte. "Ms. Bennett, we would like to discuss a partnership." Ethan's expression changed. A partnership. With Charlotte. Not through him. Not because of him. Because of her. The investor turned toward Ethan politely. "Mr. Caldwell, congratulations. Your former partner has created something remarkable." Former partner. The words landed differently than Ethan expected. Because everyone in the room now understood what he had spent years hiding. Charlotte was never just the woman behind him. She was the foundation beneath him. And now she was standing on her own. The night ended with cameras capturing one final image. Charlotte Bennett walking out of the venue surrounded by opportunities. Madison walking beside her. And Ethan Caldwell standing behind them. Watching the woman he underestimated become the one person he could never replace. Because the greatest revenge was never destroying someone else's success. It was creating a life so powerful that they had no choice but to witness it. Years ago, Charlotte Bennett thought winning meant making Ethan Caldwell regret losing her. But standing alone beneath the lights of her own runway, she finally understood something far greater. She had never been fighting to defeat him. She had been fighting to find herself. The morning after the runway show, the world looked different. Not because Charlotte Bennett had changed overnight. She had changed long before. The world was simply catching up. Every major fashion publication carried the same image. Charlotte standing beneath the spotlight. Charlotte accepting applause. Charlotte wearing a creation that carried only one name. Her own. For years, people had known her as Ethan Caldwell's former wife. A woman who disappeared after a painful divorce. A woman who walked away from one of the biggest fashion empires in America. But now, the headlines told a different story. Charlotte Bennett, the designer behind the vision. Not his wife. Not his partner. Not someone standing in the background. Just Charlotte. And for the first time, she saw her name exactly where it belonged. At the center. Inside her Brooklyn studio, Charlotte placed the newspaper on her desk. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Not because she needed validation. She already had that. She looked because she remembered the woman who once believed she needed someone else's approval to matter. The woman who sat across from Ethan during their divorce, silently accepting that the world would never know the truth. That woman felt so far away now. Charlotte touched the old sewing machine sitting in the corner. The same machine everyone else would have thrown away. The same machine that helped her rebuild. A small smile appeared on her face. Because the most valuable things in life were not always the things people recognized first. Sometimes they were the things that survived. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell faced a reality he could no longer avoid. Caldwell Empire was still successful. The company still had investors. The brand still carried influence. But something had changed. People were asking questions. Not about Charlotte. About him. Former employees began speaking about the early years. Old designs were being examined. Fashion critics started comparing Charlotte's original sketches with the collections Ethan presented as his own. The truth was no longer hidden. And Ethan hated that. Not because he lost control of the company. Because he lost control of the story. One evening, Ethan stood inside the same office where he once told Charlotte that success belonged to the person who knew how to sell an idea. He looked around the room. The expensive furniture. The awards. The photographs. Everything that represented his success. But now he noticed something he ignored for years. Almost everything began with someone else. And the person he underestimated most had become the person everyone respected. For the first time, Ethan understood the difference between ownership and achievement. He had owned the company. But Charlotte had created the value. Meanwhile, Madison Reed made a decision that surprised everyone. She left Caldwell Empire. Not dramatically. Not with accusations. Not with revenge. She simply walked away. Because she finally understood what Charlotte had learned. A beautiful cage was still a cage. Months later, Madison visited Charlotte's new headquarters. It was no longer a small studio. It was a growing fashion house filled with young designers, creative energy, and people who believed in the future Charlotte was building. She looked around quietly. "This is what you were trying to create all along," Madison said. Charlotte smiled. No, she looked at the team working around them. "This is what I created when I stopped trying to prove myself." Those words stayed with Madison. Because that was the lesson neither woman learned until they lost something. Their worth was never decided by who chose them. It was decided by who they became after being left behind. Years later, Charlotte's company became one of the most respected names in fashion. But she never forgot where she started. The small apartment. The broken sewing machine. The nights when nobody knew her name. She kept those memories because they reminded her of the most important victory. Not becoming more powerful than Ethan. Becoming someone who no longer measured her power against him. One evening, Charlotte stood backstage before another runway show. The lights were brighter. The audience was larger. The world was watching. A young designer approached her nervously. "Ms. Bennett, what is the secret to success?" Charlotte looked toward the runway. The same place where everything changed. She thought about the years of silence. The betrayal. The rebuilding. The woman she used to be. Then she smiled. "The secret is knowing that your value doesn't disappear when someone fails to see it." The young designer nodded. And Charlotte walked toward the lights. Not to prove anything. Not to make anyone regret losing her. But because she finally understood. The greatest revenge was never making someone feel your absence. It was building a life so beautiful that their opinion no longer mattered. Ethan Caldwell lost the woman who built his dream. But Charlotte Bennett gained something far more valuable. She gained herself. And that was the one thing nobody could ever take away. She didn't win him back. She won herself.